"Nobody silences me," declared the billionaire, until his employee delivered a response he never saw coming. Hit that like button and drop a comment below as we dive into our story. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pristine lawns of the Blackwood estate, where the sweet fragrance of blooming jasmine mingled with the earthy scent of freshly turned soil, creating an aromatic symphony that stood in stark contrast to the volatile tension crackling through the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Jonathan Blackwood Sterling, at 46 years of imposing presence, wore a hand-tailored Savile Row suit worth $30,000 that seemed molded to his athletic frame, maintained by a team of personal trainers and nutritionists who catered to his every physical need. He towered over the petite figure kneeling among the flower beds like a monument to arrogance and wealth. His steel-grey eyes, inherited from generations of industrial barons who had built the Sterling energy empire from nothing, blazed with a barely contained fury that he rarely needed to unleash, as his mere presence typically sufficed to intimidate anyone who dared cross his path. "I specifically ordered white orchids, not these gaudy purple monstrosities you've planted." His voice boomed across the garden with such force that even the songbirds fell silent in the surrounding oak trees. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? Do you comprehend the magnitude of your incompetence? I am Jonathan Blackwood Sterling. My family has powered half this state for 3 generations. My grandfather, Theodore Sterling, built this empire from the ground up with his bare hands, and you, a common gardener, have the audacity to disregard my explicit instructions." Victoria Rose Matthews, 39 years old, remained on her knees beside the flower bed, her work-hardened hands still, gently cradling a young orchid stem she had been about to plant when the verbal assault began. Her auburn hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail, caught the golden sunlight and framed a face that, despite bearing the lines carved by years of outdoor labor and the grief of early widowhood, retained a quiet dignity and natural beauty that no amount of expensive cosmetics could purchase. She stayed silent for what felt like an eternity, her warm brown eyes fixed on the rich soil before her, as if drawing strength from some deep wellspring within her soul. "Are you listening to me, woman?" Jonathan stepped closer, his shadow completely engulfing Victoria's kneeling form. "When I speak, people listen. When I give an order, people obey. Nobody, and I mean nobody, silences me. I could destroy your pathetic existence with a single phone call. I could ensure you never work in this city, this state, this entire country again. So I suggest your grandfather preferred purple orchids." Victoria's gentle but unwavering voice sliced through Jonathan's tirade like a blade through silk. She rose slowly to her feet, brushing the soil from her worn work pants, and for the first time lifted her gaze to meet his directly. Theodore Sterling spent the final 4 months of his life asking to see purple orchids. He said they reminded him of his grandmother, Lily May, who cultivated an entire greenhouse full of them in Georgia before moving west to build her fortune. Jonathan's face, which moments before had been flushed with rage, suddenly drained of all color, as though he'd been struck by lightning. His hands, clenched into fists at his sides, began to tremble slightly. How dare you speak of my grandfather? You didn't even know him. He passed away 3 years ago, and you only started working here 7 months ago." Victoria took a step forward, and there was something in her bearing, an unshakable dignity, an inner strength that made Jonathan involuntarily step backward. "I was your grandfather's private nurse during the last months of his life, Mr. Sterling. Before I became a gardener, before I lost my husband, I was a registered nurse. Your grandfather hired me personally in secret because he no longer trusted anyone else in his inner circle. He had confessions to make, secrets to reveal before his time came, and he knew his days were numbered." "That's impossible! You're lying!" Jonathan shouted, but his voice had lost its earlier conviction. "My grandfather would have told me if he never mentioned a private nurse. The doctor said he died alone that night in the hospital. He died peacefully, Mr. Sterling, but he wasn't alone," Victoria continued, her voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality. "I was holding his hand when he drew his final breath. And before that, during those long, sleepless nights when the pain kept him awake, he told me many things. Things about you, about your family, about the secrets that were consuming him from the inside faster than any disease ever could. Jonathan staggered as if physically struck. He reached for one of the marble pillars of the nearby gazebo for support, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "You're making this up. You have to be making this up." Why would he confide in a stranger? Why would he tell family secrets to someone like you? "Because sometimes," Victoria replied gently, approaching him with the same caution one would use with a wounded animal, "it's easier to confess our deepest sins to someone who has no connection to our world, someone who can listen without judgment, someone who can offer absolution without consequences. Your grandfather was dying, Mr. Sterling, and he wasn't afraid of death itself, but of dying with the truth buried alongside him." "What truth?" Jonathan's voice had diminished to a hoarse whisper. "What are you talking about?" Victoria drew a deep breath, gazing up at the sky that was beginning to paint itself in shades of orange and violet as evening approached. "Your mother, Eleanor Sterling Blackwood, didn't die in a car accident when you were 7 years old, as you've always been told. She's alive, Mr. Sterling. She's been living in a private psychiatric facility in the mountains of Colorado for the past 39 years. The silence that followed was so profound that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Jonathan slid down the marble column until he was sitting on the gazebo's stone floor, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. "No, that can't be true. I saw the funeral. I remember the casket, the flowers, all those people crying. An empty casket, Mr. Sterling. An elaborate charade orchestrated by your grandfather to protect the family's reputation." Victoria seated herself carefully on a nearby bench, maintaining a respectful distance while keeping at his eye level. "Your mother suffered from what we now understand as severe postpartum psychosis after your birth. In those days, especially in families like yours, such conditions were seen as shameful, an unforgivable weakness. When she tried to take her own life for the 4th time, your grandfather made the decision to have her permanently institutionalized and stage her death to avoid scandal." "My God!" Jonathan buried his face in his hands, his entire body shaking. "All these years, all those visits to her grave, all those tears I shed over an empty tomb." "Your grandfather shed real tears too," Victoria said softly. "He loved your mother deeply, but he loved the family image more, the empire he had built, the legacy he wanted to preserve. It was a choice that haunted him for the rest of his life. In his final days, he made me promise that someday, when the time was right, I would tell you the truth." "Why now?" Jonathan raised his head, his eyes red and glistening. "Why did you choose this moment, when I was treating you so horribly?" Victoria smiled sadly. "Because I saw in you the same rage, the same need to control everything and everyone around you that your grandfather had. And I saw where that path leads. Your grandfather died alone, Mr. Sterling, not because there was no one who cared about him, but because he had pushed everyone away with his need to maintain appearances, with his obsession for control. He didn't want you to follow the same road." Jonathan stood abruptly, walking to the edge of the gazebo and staring out at the garden that now seemed completely different through his eyes. The purple orchids he had moments before called monstrosities now seemed to glow with a soft, nostalgic light. "Is she really alive? Is my mother truly alive?" "At the Clearwater Sanctuary in the Rocky Mountains," Victoria confirmed. "She goes by the name Margaret now. Your grandfather sent money monthly to the facility, officially listed as charitable donations. She doesn't know he's dead. The staff was instructed never to give her news from the outside world, part of the agreement your grandfather made with the facility director." "I need to see her," Jonathan said, his voice breaking. "I need to tell her that I didn't know, that I would have visited her if I had known, that I never would have left her alone all these years." "There's more, Mr. Sterling," Victoria said gently. "Your mother isn't alone at the facility. There's someone with her, someone you need to know about." Jonathan spun around sharply. "What do you mean by that?" You have a sister, Mr. Sterling, a younger sister named Grace. She was born at the facility 8 months after your mother was admitted. Your grandfather never knew about the pregnancy. Grace was raised by the facility staff and now works as a social worker helping troubled youth in Denver. She's 37 years old and has no idea she has family. The weight of these revelations made Jonathan stumble backward. He gripped the gazebo railing, his knuckles turning white from the force of his hold. A sister. I have a sister. All these years thinking I was the last of the Sterlings, and I had a sister. Your grandfather discovered Grace only in the final year of his life, Victoria explained. That's actually why he hired me. He had received an anonymous letter with a photograph of Grace. The family resemblance was unmistakable. He wanted to investigate discreetly, and as a nurse, I had legitimate reasons to travel and ask questions at hospitals and care facilities. And you confirmed she's really my sister? I arranged for discreet DNA testing. Grace participated in a blood drive at the community center where she volunteers. I had access to your grandfather's medical samples. The match was 99.7%. She is your sister, Mr. Sterling, and from the photograph I have, she has the same steel-grey eyes that run in the Sterling family. Jonathan remained silent for several long minutes, processing the enormity of what he had just learned. The garden around him seemed to have transformed entirely, as if he were seeing a new world through different eyes. The flowers he had scorned minutes earlier now held profound meaning, connecting him to a mother he thought was dead and a sister whose existence he had never imagined. Victoria, he said finally, his voice barely audible, how could you care for my grandfather knowing all this, knowing the lies he had built, the pain he had caused? Because in the end, Mr. Sterling, your grandfather was a broken man who needed redemption as much as forgiveness, Victoria replied. And because I've learned that hatred only breeds more suffering. Your grandfather was already paying for his choices with every labored breath he took. My role wasn't to judge him, but to help him find peace before the end. My mother, what does she know about me? Does she remember what I was like as a child? Victoria smiled tenderly. She keeps a small wooden toy horse that belonged to you when you were 5 years old. She carries it in her sweater pocket every day. The staff tells me she talks about her little Johnny during her quiet moments. Tears began streaming down Jonathan's cheeks without him trying to stop them. All the fury, the arrogance, the iron control he had maintained for decades crumbled in that instant, leaving him vulnerable and human for the first time in years. Victoria, seeing his anguish, moved closer without saying a word and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice like that of a lost child. "How do I face all of this? How do I rebuild a life that was built on lies?" "One step at a time," Victoria replied wisely. "First, you need to process all of this. Then, when you're ready, we can plan how to approach your mother and your sister. But you must be prepared, Mr. Sterling. This journey will change everything you thought you knew about yourself and your family." Night had fallen completely over the garden, and the automatic lighting system illuminated the pathways, creating a magical ambience among the flowers. Jonathan looked at Victoria, truly seeing her for the first time not as an employee, but as the extraordinary woman who had been brave enough to confront him with the truth and compassionate enough to support him as his world collapsed and rebuilt itself. "Victoria," he said softly, "thank you. Not just for telling me the truth, but for the way you did it, for caring for my grandfather when I couldn't, for..." He paused, struggling with emotions he had kept buried for decades. "You don't need to thank me, Mr. Sterling. You just need to decide what kind of man you want to be from now on, what kind of legacy you want to leave. Your grandfather lived with his secrets and died with his regrets. You have the chance to choose a different path." Jonathan nodded, feeling as though he were awakening from a decades-long sleep. The garden, the flowers, Victoria, everything seemed more real, more vivid than anything he had experienced before. He realized that for the first time in his adult life, he didn't have a master plan, didn't have absolute control over the situation. And surprisingly, that sensation didn't terrify him, but rather liberated him. "Tomorrow," he said finally. "Tomorrow we'll start planning the trip to Colorado. But tonight Tonight I need to be alone to process all of this. Victoria, would you stay with me? Not as an employee, but as the only person who truly understands what's happening." Victoria hesitated for a moment, aware of the implications of what he was asking. But seeing the genuine vulnerability in his eyes, she nodded. "Of course, Mr. Sterling. I'll be here as long as you need." As they walked together back toward the mansion, the garden behind them seemed to whisper promises of transformation and new beginnings. The purple orchids, now clearly visible under the night lighting, stood like small beacons of hope in the darkness, reminding them that sometimes the most beautiful truths grow from the most painful soil. The first chapter of a redemption story was beginning, built on the foundation of finally revealed secrets and two souls who had found the courage to face the past and forge an entirely new future. In the quiet of that transformative evening, surrounded by the sweet fragrance of night-blooming flowers, Jonathan Blackwood Sterling began to understand that true power didn't come from silencing others, but from having the courage to listen, to change, and to love. Jonathan spent the entire night pacing through his private study, Victoria's revelations echoing in his mind like church bells from a distant cathedral. The mahogany-paneled walls, which had once given him a sense of power and stability, now seemed to close in around him, suffocating him with the weight of secrets that had remained hidden for so long. He had dismissed all the household staff, claiming he needed solitude, but the truth was that he couldn't bear the thought of maintaining his usual facade of control and authority when his inner world was in complete chaos. At 5 in the morning, unable to continue alone with his thoughts, he descended to the garden, where he found Victoria still working under the soft glow of the ornamental lamps, carefully transplanting the purple orchid seedlings to the main bed, precisely where he had originally demanded the white orchids be planted. "Don't you sleep?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. Victoria looked up, showing no surprise at seeing him there. "I sleep very little since my husband died, Mr. Sterling. The night is when I can work in peace, when I can talk to the plants without seeming crazy," she replied with a small, sad smile. "And you, I imagine sleeping must be impossible after everything I revealed today." Jonathan sat on a nearby garden bench, not caring that his $1,000 silk pajamas might get soiled. "Victoria, may I call you Victoria?" When she nodded affirmatively, he continued, "I need to know everything. Every detail my grandfather told you. I need to understand how he could live with these lies for so long." Victoria cleaned her hands on a cloth and sat on the ground near him, keeping herself busy arranging her gardening tools while she spoke. "Your grandfather was a complex man, Jonathan. He was raised in an era when family appearance was everything. His father, your great-grandfather Samuel Sterling, was even more rigid and controlling. When your grandfather fell in love with your mother Eleanor, it was the only act of rebellion he allowed himself in his entire life. Eleanor was the daughter of a small-town doctor, middle class, considered unsuitable for a Sterling, but your grandfather fought for that union, threatened to renounce his inheritance, and eventually Samuel relented. "I never knew that," Jonathan murmured. "I was always told my mother came from old money in Boston." "Another lie to maintain appearances," Victoria continued. "Your mother was brilliant, Jonathan. She had a master's degree in psychology, spoke 4 languages, wrote poetry that was published in literary magazines. But after marriage, she was expected to abandon all that and become the perfect society wife. The breakdown that came after your birth was, according to what your grandfather told me, the result not just of hormonal issues, but of the suffocation of her free spirit. And my grandfather chose to lock her away instead of helping her," Jonathan said bitterly. "He believed he was helping her," Victoria said gently. "In his mind, shaped by the attitudes of that time and family pressure, committing your mother to a place where she could receive treatment was the most merciful solution. The Clearwater Sanctuary was known for accepting women from high society with nervous conditions. They received care, had comfort, and their families could visit them discreetly. But he never visited her," Jonathan said, the accusation clear in his voice. "Not after the first year," Victoria confirmed. "He told me that during the early visits, Your mother would beg to come home to see you. She promised she would be better, that she would be the wife he wanted. But when she realized he would never take her back, she stopped talking to him. The last time he saw her, she simply looked at him and said, "You buried who I was, Theodore. Now let me rest in peace." He never returned after that. Jonathan stood abruptly and began walking through the garden, his hands buried deep in his pockets. "And Grace? How was she born if my mother was institutionalized?" Victoria hesitated before answering. "Your grandfather suspected, but was never certain. There was a doctor at the facility, a young psychiatrist who believed in more humane treatment methods. He spent considerable time with your mother, trying to help her through conversation and art therapy. 9 months later, Grace was born. The doctor disappeared shortly after the birth, suddenly transferred to a clinic in Alaska. Your mother never revealed who the father was." Jesus Christ! Jonathan ran his hands through his hair. "And my grandfather just accepted that. He never knew, Jonathan. The facility staff concealed both the pregnancy and the birth. They registered Grace as an abandoned foundling. It was only in his final year, when he received that anonymous letter, that your grandfather discovered the truth." "Who sent the letter?" Jonathan asked. "Your grandfather suspected it was the facility director herself, now a very elderly woman wanting to clear her conscience before dying. But we never had confirmation," Victoria replied. Jonathan stopped walking and stared directly at Victoria. "Why did you come back here after my grandfather died? Why did you apply for the gardening position?" Victoria looked away, showing discomfort for the first time. "I promised your grandfather I would watch over you in a way, that I would ensure you learned the truth when the time was right. And I needed the work. After my husband died, leaving only debts, and with a teenage daughter to raise, I needed any job I could get." Your husband? How did he die?" Jonathan asked, noticing the pain that crossed Victoria's face. "Industrial accident," she replied simply, but there was something in her tone that suggested more to the story. "Where did he work?" Victoria raised her eyes to meet his. "Sterling Power Plant number 4. He was a safety engineer. He died when a boiler valve exploded. The same valve he had reported as needing urgent replacement 5 times, but the work order was denied because the shutdown for maintenance would cost too much in lost production." The blood drained from Jonathan's face. When did that happen?" 4 years ago, 6 months before your grandfather became ill," Victoria replied, her voice neutral, without accusation, but the implied truth was devastating. "That's why my grandfather hired you," Jonathan said, finally understanding. "He felt guilty. He discovered the connection only after hiring me," Victoria clarified. "I used my maiden name at the facility, but when he found out, yes, he felt responsible. He told me he had personally signed the denial of the maintenance request. It was one of many regrets he carried." Jonathan sank onto the bench again, the weight of all these revelations crushing him. "My God, Victoria, my grandfather was responsible for your husband's death, and still you cared for him. You held his hand while he died." "Your grandfather was a shattered man at the end, Jonathan," Victoria said softly. "He was paying for his sins with every painful breath he took. What right did I have to deny him what little comfort I could offer? Anger wouldn't bring my David back. Forgiveness, however, gave me peace." "How do you manage to forgive?" Jonathan asked, genuinely bewildered. "If someone were responsible for the death of someone I loved, I would seek revenge, destroy lives." Victoria interrupted gently. "And what would that accomplish, except spreading more pain? My husband is dead, Jonathan. Nothing can change that. But my daughter is alive, and she needs me whole, not consumed by hatred and bitterness." "Your daughter? How old is she?" "Emma is 16. She's brilliant, Jonathan. She has a full scholarship at the academy. She wants to be an engineer. Says she wants to build safe things to honor her father's memory." Victoria smiled with maternal pride. "She doesn't know about the connection to the power plant. I told her only that it was a workplace accident." Jonathan remained silent for long moments, processing everything. Finally, he said, "I want to meet her, Emma, and I want to make amends somehow." "No," Victoria said firmly. "Emma doesn't need to carry the burden of sins that aren't hers or yours. She's happy, Jonathan. She has a mother who loves her, an excellent education and a bright future ahead. Don't complicate that with guilt and conscience money. But I could help with college with, Jonathan insisted. If you really want to help, Victoria interrupted, then change how Sterling Power operates. Implement the safety protocols that are needed. Make sure no other family goes through what mine did. That would be the best memorial for my husband and all the others who died because profit was placed above people. Jonathan nodded, accepting the implicit rebuke. You're right. I'll do that. I promise. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds being the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the night breeze. Finally, Jonathan spoke again. Tell me more about my mother. How is she now? Victoria smiled softly. According to my contacts at the facility, she's found peace. She tends the facility's garden, especially the orchids. She teaches literature to the younger patients and helps with the children's reading program. She's loved and respected. As Margaret, she found the purpose that was denied to her as Eleanor Sterling. Does she remember me? Jonathan asked, his voice small and vulnerable. She has a music box that played your favorite lullaby when you were little. She whines it every evening before bed. The staff says she hums along and calls it her Johnny's song. Victoria replied. Jonathan covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Victoria rose and, after a moment's hesitation, placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. They remained like that for a long time, the powerful energy magnate crying, like the child who had lost his mother so many years ago, and the humble gardener offering the comfort that his grandfather never could give or receive. When he finally composed himself, Jonathan looked up at Victoria. Will you come with me? To Colorado, to see my mother and meet Grace. I couldn't do it alone. Victoria hesitated. Jonathan, I'm just your gardener. It wouldn't be appropriate. You're much more than that, Jonathan interrupted, and there was something in his eyes that made Victoria blush slightly. You're the keeper of my family's secrets, the only person I can trust completely. Please, come with me. My daughter, Victoria began. Bring Emma too. It'll be an educational experience for her. All expenses paid, naturally, Jonathan insisted. Victoria wavered, but something in the vulnerability of Jonathan's eyes made her yield. All right, but only as your assistant. Nothing more. As they planned the journey in the days that followed, Jonathan found himself in a constant state of agitation. The revelations had stirred something deep within him, something that had been buried under years of arrogance and control. He surprised himself by paying attention to details he would have previously ignored. The way Victoria spoke tenderly to the plants, how her eyes lit up when she talked about her daughter, the natural grace with which she moved through the garden as if she were part of it. The night before their departure, he found her once again working in the garden under the stars, this time pruning the rose bushes that had begun to flourish since her arrival. Victoria, he said softly, so as not to startle her. Don't you ever rest? She smiled without looking up from her work. Plants don't keep regular hours, Jonathan. And I sleep better knowing I've accomplished something useful during the day. How do you do that? He asked, sitting on the ground beside her, something that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Do what? Find peace in such simple things. Find purpose in this. He gestured toward the flowers. Victoria finally looked at him, her eyes gleaming softly in the moonlight. Do you know what my husband told me the day before he died? He said, Victoria, the most beautiful things in life can't be bought, can't be controlled. They can only be cared for. Care for the flowers, care for Emma, care for your heart. Everything else is just noise. He was a wise man, Jonathan said quietly. He was, and he would have wanted me to be happy, to find beauty, even after losing him. The plants taught me that. Every day they can either die or flourish, depending on the care they receive. I chose to be the caretaker, not the destroyer. Jonathan reached out and hesitantly touched one of the flowers she had just pruned. Do you think it's too late for me to learn to be different? Jonathan, Victoria placed her hand gently over his. The strongest plants are often those that grow in the hardest soil. You've lived in difficult ground, but that doesn't mean you can't bloom. You just need to learn to tend to yourself and others with the same dedication you've put into controlling and dominating. In that moment, under the starlit sky, surrounded by the sweet scent of night-blooming flowers, Jonathan felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Hope, not the calculated hope of a businessman planning his next move, but the pure, vulnerable hope of a human being believing that real change was possible. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "tomorrow we'll begin discovering who I really am beneath all these masks." "Tomorrow," Victoria agreed, "we'll start planting seeds for a different future." And in the quiet of the garden, with the flowers as silent witnesses, two wounded souls began to imagine the possibility of healing, of redemption, of a love story that would grow not from blind passion, but from deep knowledge of each other's pain and the conscious choice to create beauty together. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of changes in Jonathan Blackwood Sterling's life. He had discreetly hired a trusted private investigator to verify all the information Victoria had shared, and every detail proved to be true. The photographs of Grace that the detective managed to obtain showed a woman of serene beauty, with the unmistakable sterling grey eyes, working with children at a modest community center in Denver, completely unaware of the fortune that was rightfully hers by birth. Jonathan had changed visibly during those weeks. The estate staff noticed he no longer shouted, made no unreasonable demands, and had even begun greeting them by name. He spent hours in the garden, frequently conversing with Victoria while she worked, learning not only about plants and flowers, but about humility, forgiveness, and the true value of life's simple things. "I'm leaving for Colorado tomorrow," he announced one afternoon, finding Victoria pruning the orchids that now bloomed in abundance. "I need to see my mother and meet Grace." Victoria stopped her work and looked at him with concern. "Are you certain you're ready for this, Jonathan? There are decades of hurt and secrets to untangle." "I'll never be completely ready," he admitted, "but I can't keep postponing this. Every day that passes is another day lost. My mother is aging, and Grace deserves to know she has family." "How will you approach Grace? She has no idea who you are," Victoria asked. "First, I'll go to the facility, speak with my mother and the director. Then, with their guidance, I'll find the best way to reach out to Grace," Jonathan explained. "Victoria, I wanted to ask, could you accompany me? You know the entire story, and your presence would be comforting." Victoria was surprised. "Jonathan, I'm just your gardener. It wouldn't be proper." "You're so much more than that," Jonathan interrupted, and there was something in his eyes that made Victoria's cheeks flush. "You're the guardian of my family's secrets, the only person I can trust completely. Please, come with me." "My daughter," Victoria began. "Bring Emma as well. It'll be educational for her. All expenses covered, of course," Jonathan insisted. Victoria hesitated, but something in Jonathan's vulnerable expression made her relent. "Very well, but strictly as your assistant, nothing more." The journey to Colorado was surreal for Victoria and Emma. They had never flown first class, never stayed in five-star hotels. Emma, an intelligent and observant teenager, noticed the underlying tension between her mother and their wealthy employer, but had the good sense not to comment. The Clearwater Sanctuary was nestled in the mountains, a century-old stone building that seemed to have grown organically from the mountainside itself. When Jonathan stood frozen at the entrance, trembling despite his expensive coat, Victoria gently took his arm. "Courage," she whispered. "Your mother has been waiting for this moment for decades." The facility director, an elderly woman with penetrating but kind eyes, received them in the visitors' lounge. "Mr. Sterling," she said in perfect English, "I wondered when you would finally come." "You knew about me?" Jonathan asked, surprised. "Your mother always knew that one day you would discover the truth. She's been waiting, preparing herself spiritually for this meeting," the woman replied. "She's in the garden. She spends most of her time there." The facility's garden was a haven of tranquility, with geometrically perfect flower beds and a glass conservatory where orchids of every color bloomed despite the mountain cold. In the center, a woman with silver hair, dressed in simple civilian clothes, tended carefully to a bed of purple orchids. "Mother!" Jonathan's voice emerged as a strangled whisper. Eleanor Sterling, now known as Margaret, turned slowly. Her eyes, still a vibrant gray despite her age, filled with tears upon seeing the son who had been taken from her so long ago. "My little Johnny," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "My boy." Jonathan ran to her like the child he had once been, falling to his knees before her, embracing her waist while he sobbed. "Mom, forgive me. I didn't know. I thought you were dead. He told me you had died." Eleanor stroked her son's hair, her own tears falling silently. "There's nothing to forgive, my child. You were just a little boy. The forgiveness, if needed, was between your grandfather and me, and that was resolved long ago in my prayers." They spent hours talking in the garden, with Eleanor telling Jonathan about her life at the facility, about the peace she had found, about Grace. Victoria and Emma had withdrawn discreetly to give them privacy, but Jonathan insisted they join them. "Mother, this is Victoria Matthews," Jonathan introduced. "She cared for grandfather in his final months and she's been my salvation these past weeks." Eleanor took Victoria's hands in hers, studying her face carefully. "You have kind eyes, my dear. I can see why Theodore trusted you and why my Jonathan values you so highly. And this is Emma, Victoria's daughter," Jonathan continued. Eleanor smiled warmly at the teenager. "You have the glow of intelligence in your eyes, child. Your mother must be very proud of you." The conversation eventually turned to Grace. "She knows nothing about any of this," Eleanor explained. "To her, I'm just Margaret, one of the residents she visits. She believes her biological parents abandoned her. It was safer that way, better for her to grow up without the burden of the Sterling name. But now she needs to know," Jonathan insisted. "She has a right to her inheritance, to her family." "Be careful, my son," Eleanor warned. "Grace has built a life based on her own achievements, her own merit. Revealing all this could destroy everything she believes about herself." "Then how do I do this?" Jonathan asked desperately. "With time, patience, and great care," Eleanor replied. "She visits me every Sunday. You could start coming on those days, getting to know her gradually as a visitor to the facility. Let a relationship develop naturally before revealing the truth." Jonathan agreed, though patience had never been his virtue. In the following Sundays, he began visiting the facility, always accompanied by Victoria. Grace, a graceful woman with a warm smile that illuminated her entire face, was initially cautious of the wealthy businessman who inexplicably began frequenting the facility, but gradually lowered her guard. "You seem familiar," she told Jonathan one Sunday, after several weeks of casual conversations. "It's strange, but I feel like I know you from somewhere." Jonathan had to use all his self-control not to reveal everything right then. It was Victoria who smoothly changed the subject, saving him from ruining everything. The revelation finally came on an autumn Sunday when the leaves on the trees surrounding the facility were painted in shades of gold and crimson. Eleanor, with Jonathan and Victoria beside her, sat with Grace in the garden and gently unveiled the truth of her origins. Grace's reaction was an emotional roller coaster: shock, denial, anger, sadness, and finally cautious acceptance. "A brother," she said, looking at Jonathan with those sterling eyes that were so similar to his own. "I always wanted a brother when I was little." "You have one," Jonathan said, extending his hand to her, "and you always will." But while the family reunion in Colorado was bittersweet and hopeful, storms were brewing back east. Jonathan's prolonged absence and sudden behavioral changes had alerted the corporate sharks circling the Sterling Empire. His vice president, Marcus Webb, an ambitious man who had spent years waiting for an opportunity to seize control, began planting seeds of doubt in the board of directors. "Jonathan's unstable," Webb whispered in board members' ears. "He's neglecting business, wasting company money on personal trips, and now I hear he's talking about implementing expensive safety reforms that will cut our profits in half." When Jonathan returned from Colorado with plans to bring Grace to the East Coast and establish her there, he found a full corporate rebellion waiting for him. The board had called an emergency meeting to discuss his competency as CEO. "This is ridiculous," Jonathan thundered in the boardroom, some of his old self returning in the face of betrayal. "This company was built by my grandfather. It's my birthright. And you're destroying it with your emotional decisions," Webb replied coldly. "The safety reforms you're proposing will cost billions. For what? To ease your guilty conscience." It was Victoria, who had accompanied Jonathan to the meeting as his new personal assistant, who provided the necessary ammunition. She had spent weeks compiling data on power plant accidents, pending lawsuits, and the real cost of safety negligence. "Gentlemen," she said, standing and distributing folders to each board member. What you have before you are the actual costs of unsafe practices. Over the past 6 years, this company has paid more in settlements, fines, and lawsuits than it would cost to implement all the reforms Mr. Sterling is proposing. And that's not counting the intangible costs in reputation and human lives. Who is this woman? Webb asked dismissively. Since when do gardeners participate in board meetings? She's my chief officer of corporate responsibility, Jonathan replied firmly. And she's right. We're hemorrhaging money because of our negligence. The reforms aren't charity. They're sound business sense. The battle was fierce, but eventually Jonathan prevailed, mainly because several board members were swayed by Victoria's irrefutable data and unexpected support from international investors who had been pushing for more sustainable practices. But victory came at a price. The stress and pressure caused Jonathan to partially revert to his old habits. He became distant and cold again, burying himself in work to prove he was still the leader the company needed. Victoria watched with concern as he withdrew, cancelling dinners they had planned, ignoring her attempts at conversation. "You're losing yourself again," she told him one night, finding him alone in his office at 3 a.m, surrounded by financial reports. "I'm doing what needs to be done," he replied without looking up. "I can't afford to show weakness now." "Weakness?" Victoria approached his desk. "You think showing humanity is weakness? That caring about people is weakness? In the business world, yes," Jonathan replied bitterly. "They nearly tore me apart because I showed compassion." "No," Victoria said firmly. "They tried to tear you apart because you threatened their inflated profits built on other people's suffering. There's a difference." Jonathan finally looked up, and Victoria was shocked to see how exhausted he appeared. "Sometimes I wonder if it wouldn't be easier to go back to being who I was. Ignorant, arrogant, but in control." "You were never in control," Victoria said softly. "You were a prisoner of your own anger and loneliness, just like your grandfather was. Don't make the same mistake, Jonathan. Not now that you've found your family, that you have the chance to do things differently." Something about her use of his first name without the Mr. made Jonathan really look at her. Over the past months, he had begun to see her not just as an employee or confidant, but as something more. Her strength, her compassion, her integrity, everything about her attracted him in a way he had never experienced before. "Victoria," he said, standing and walking around his desk. "There's something I need to say." But Victoria stepped back, shaking her head. "No, Jonathan, not now. You're vulnerable, confused, and I work for you. It would be inappropriate." "Ah, to hell with appropriate," Jonathan exploded. "My whole life has been about what's appropriate, what's expected. Look where that's gotten me." "Jonathan," Victoria said gently but firmly, "I lost my husband less than 4 years ago. You've just discovered your entire life was built on lies. We both need time to heal before anything else." Jonathan wanted to argue, wanted to take her in his arms and prove that what he felt was real, not just a reaction to trauma. But the respect he had developed for her stopped him. "You're right," he said finally, stepping away. "As always, you're right." "Not always," Victoria said with a small smile. "But this time, yes. Go home, Jonathan. Sleep. Tomorrow Grace arrives, and she'll need all your strength and attention." Grace's arrival on the East Coast was another earthquake in the carefully ordered life Jonathan had known. The media caught wind of the story. The secret sister of the energy mogul, hidden in a Colorado facility for decades. Jonathan had to use all his influence to keep the more sordid details out of the newspapers, protecting both Grace and his mother from cruel exposure. Grace, for her part, struggled to adapt. The opulence of the Sterling estate made her uncomfortable, and she frequently escaped to the garden, where she found solace working alongside Victoria. "You love him, don't you?" Grace asked one day, as they planted a new section of orchids. Victoria nearly dropped her spade. "What are you talking about?" "My brother. You love him, and he loves you. It's obvious to anyone with eyes," Grace said, with the directness she had inherited from the Sterling family. "It's complicated," Victoria replied. "Love always is," Grace said wisely. "But that doesn't make it less real or less valid." Before Victoria could respond, they heard shouting coming from the house. Jonathan was on the phone, his face pale as paper. "There's been an accident at one of the power plants," he said, his voice shaking. An explosion. There are casualties. The news was on every channel. Sterling Power Plant East had suffered a massive explosion. 7 workers confirmed dead, dozens injured. Preliminary cause, a faulty boiler valve that had been on the maintenance list for months. My God, Jonathan collapsed into the nearest chair. It's exactly like what happened to your husband, Victoria. Victoria felt her heart clench, painful memories flooding back. But instead of retreating, she moved closer to Jonathan, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. Then make sure these deaths aren't in vain. Use this to force the changes that are necessary. Jonathan looked at her, seeing not accusation, but support in her eyes. Come with me to the power plant. I need you there. Jonathan, I don't know if I can, Victoria began, thinking how painful it would be to be at a power plant again. Please, he pleaded. I can't do this alone. The visit to the destroyed power plant was a definitive turning point in Jonathan Blackwood Sterling's life. Seeing the faces of grieving families, hearing their stories, feeling the same desperation Victoria must have felt when she lost David, all of this solidified his determination to change not just safety practices, but the entire corporate culture of the Sterling Empire. In the months that followed, Jonathan worked tirelessly to implement radical reforms. He established the David Matthews Foundation for Industrial Safety, named in honor of Victoria's husband, with a multi-billion-dollar fund dedicated not only to improving safety at Sterling companies, but throughout the entire American energy industry. He personally visited every power plant, every facility, talking with workers, listening to their concerns, implementing their suggestions. Victoria was by his side throughout the process, officially as his director of social responsibility, but in reality as much more, his conscience, his anchor, his inspiration. She had brought Emma to work part-time at the foundation, helping with educational programs for workers' children, and the brilliant teenager had flourished in the role. Grace had also found her place, establishing a community mental health center in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods, funded by her brother, but maintaining the simplicity and values she had learned at the facility. Eleanor had decided to remain at Clearwater Sanctuary, but now received regular visits from her children, and weekly video calls brought joy to her remaining years. It was on a spring afternoon, exactly 1 year after that first confrontation in the garden, that everything changed definitively between Jonathan and Victoria. They were in the same gazebo where Jonathan had learned about his family's secrets, reviewing plans for a memorial to workers killed in industrial accidents. Victoria, Jonathan said suddenly, setting the papers aside. Enough time has passed. Time enough for what? She asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. For both of us to heal, to discover who we are beyond our pain. Jonathan stood and knelt before her, taking a small velvet box from his pocket. Victoria Rose Matthews, you taught me what it means to be truly human. You showed me that real strength comes from vulnerability, that true power comes from serving others. I love you not as my employee, not as my savior, but as the woman I want beside me for the rest of my life. Will you marry me? Victoria looked at the ring, not an ostentatious piece, as would be expected from a Sterling, but an elegant solitaire surrounded by small sapphires that reminded her of the forget-me-nots she had planted in memory of her husband. Jonathan, she began, tears streaming down her face. I love you too, but I need you to understand. I won't be a trophy wife. I won't abandon my work, my passions, who I am. I wouldn't want you to be different, Jonathan said fervently. I fell in love with the woman who kneels in the dirt and makes beautiful things grow, who faces arrogant billionaires without fear, who forgives the unforgivable. I want a partner, Victoria, not an ornament. And Emma? Victoria asked. She's my priority. She'll be our priority, Jonathan corrected. I've already spoken with her, asked for her blessing. She said, and I quote, "It's about time you two stopped dancing around the obvious." Victoria laughed through her tears. That girl is impossible. She takes after her mother, Jonathan said with a smile. So what's your answer? Yes, Victoria whispered. 1,000 times yes. The wedding was a celebration that shattered every social convention the old Jonathan would have held sacred. It was held in the estate's garden, which Victoria had transformed into a paradise of colors and fragrances. The guest list included both industry moguls and power plant workers, both social elite and the families Victoria had met through her charitable work. Eleanor had traveled from Colorado for the occasion, officiating the ceremony with special permission from the facility. Grace was Victoria's maid of honor, while Emma served as the flower girl. When Victoria walked down the makeshift aisle between the orchid beds, wearing a simple but elegant dress she had chosen herself, with no veil but a crown of garden flowers in her hair, Jonathan felt as if he were watching spring itself walking toward him. "You two found each other through pain," Eleanor said during the ceremony, "but chose to build something beautiful from it. True love isn't the absence of suffering, but the choice to grow through it together." "The vows they exchanged were written by themselves," Jonathan promised. "Victoria, you taught me that the most beautiful flowers often grow in the hardest soil. I promise to be your firm ground, your constant sun, your gentle rain when needed. I promise to honor not just you, but the memories and people who made you who you are." Victoria responded, "Jonathan, you showed me that even the most twisted tree can grow straight with care and time. I promise to be your patient gardener, your constant companion, your voice of conscience when needed. I promise to love not just who you are today, but who you're becoming every day." The reception that followed was an eclectic mix of traditions, classical music alternating with jazz, caviar served alongside barbecue, French champagne toasted alongside craft beer. Jonathan danced with Emma, promising to be not a replacement for her father, but a constant friend and supporter. Victoria danced with power plant workers who thanked her with tears in their eyes for the changes she had inspired. Marcus Webb, the vice president who had tried to overthrow Jonathan, had also been invited, a gesture from Jonathan to show he held no grudges. Surprisingly, Webb approached him during the reception. "I was wrong about you, Sterling," he said, extending his hand. "The reforms you implemented, the foundation, all of it. It hasn't just improved our image. Our profits are better than ever. ESG investors are lining up to work with us." "Victoria deserves the credit," Jonathan replied, shaking his hand. "She taught me that doing right and doing well in business aren't mutually exclusive." 5 years later, the Sterling estate garden was even more lush than before, if that were possible. But now, in addition to the flowers, there was also the sound of children's laughter. Jonathan and Victoria sat in the gazebo, now expanded to accommodate a larger family, watching their twin 4-year-olds, Theodore and Eleanor, named after the grandparents, chasing butterflies among the flower beds. Emma, now 21 and in her final year of engineering, sat nearby studying for her final exams, occasionally looking up to smile at her adoptive siblings. She had chosen to specialize in industrial safety engineering, determined to continue the legacy of accident prevention that her mother and stepfather had begun. Grace arrived with her husband, a literature professor she had met through one of her community mental health programs, and their 2 children. The center she had founded had expanded to a network of 15 facilities, all maintaining the same commitment to quality care for underserved populations. "News from Mom?" Jonathan asked when Grace joined them in the gazebo. "She's well. The new facility director says she's the happiest resident at Clearwater. She sends her love and says she's praying for the new acquisition," Grace replied, referring to Jonathan's most recent purchase, a bankrupt power plant he planned to transform into a model of safety and efficiency. "I still can't believe you bought the power plant where David worked," Victoria said, her hand finding Jonathan's. "It was the right thing to do," Jonathan replied. "We're going to turn it into a showcase of what a power plant can be when safety and people come first. The David Matthews Memorial at the entrance will always remind us why we do this." Marcus Webb, who had become a close ally and now chaired the foundation's board, arrived with his family. "Jonathan, Victoria, the quarterly numbers," he said, handing over a tablet. "The foundation has now trained over 20,000 workers in safety protocols. Fatal accidents in the industry have dropped 85%. Numbers matter," Victoria said, watching the twins now trying to climb a low tree with Emma's help. But every life saved has a face, a family, a story. Speaking of stories, Grace interjected, the documentary about our family airs next month. They want to know if you have any last-minute objections. Jonathan and Victoria looked at each other. They had agreed to participate in the documentary not out of vanity, but because they believed their story could inspire other families to confront their secrets, to choose forgiveness over bitterness, to transform privilege into responsibility. No objections, Jonathan said. It's time the world knew that the Sterling name no longer stands for greed and secrets, but for redemption and service. As the sun set over the garden, painting everything in golden tones, the assembled family represented something that had seemed impossible years before. Where there had been secrets, now there was transparency. Where there had been arrogance, humility. Where there had been isolation, community. Where there had been death and despair, life and hope. You know, Jonathan said, drawing Victoria closer, sometimes I still can't believe all this is real, that from a moment of anger and confrontation that day, all this was born. Nobody silences me, you said, Victoria recalled with a smile. Little did you know I wasn't trying to silence you, but to make you finally speak. Speak truly from the heart. And you succeeded, Jonathan said, kissing her gently. You gave me a voice to say the things that really matter. Emma approached with the twins, one on each hand, their clothes dirty from garden soil. Mom, Dad, Theodore says he wants to plant a tree, and Eleanor wants to plant flowers around it. Then let's plant, Victoria said, standing, all together. And so, as the first stars began to appear in the sky, the Sterling family, no longer defined solely by blood but by choice, love and shared purpose, knelt in the garden soil. Together they planted an oak tree, symbol of strength and endurance, surrounded by flowers of every color, each family member contributing soil, water, and care. It was a perfect portrait of transformation, from roots of secrecy and pain, through the cultivation of truth and forgiveness, had grown a strong and beautiful family tree, promising shade and beauty for generations to come. When they finished, dirty with soil but radiant with joy, Jonathan took the microphone from the garden sound system they had installed for family gatherings. A toast, he said, while Victoria distributed juice cups for the children and wine for the adults. To the gardener who taught me that the most powerful words aren't "nobody silences me," but "I hear you." To the family we chose to create, and to the garden of our lives, always growing, always blooming, always surprising us with its beauty. Cheers, they all toasted, their voices joining in perfect harmony. 10 years later, the documentary about the Sterling family had won international awards and inspired changes in corporate policies around the world. The David Matthews Foundation had become a global reference for industrial safety, saving countless lives. Emma had become a renowned engineer, married to a safety consultant she met at one of the power plants. They had 3 children and lived near the estate, now transformed into the foundation's headquarters and open to the public as a botanical garden on weekends. Theodore and Eleanor, now teenagers, had inherited the perfect combination of Sterling and Matthews genes, business determination and intelligence, combined with compassion and love for the earth. Theodore showed aptitude for sustainable engineering, while Eleanor had inherited Victoria's gift for gardening and Jonathan's business acumen, dreaming of creating a sustainable urban agriculture company. Eleanor Sterling had passed away peacefully at 93, surrounded by children and grandchildren at the facility that had been her home for so long. Her final words were, "Forgiveness liberates not only the one who is forgiven, but especially the one who forgives." Jonathan and Victoria, now in their early 60s, sat on the same garden bench where so many revelations had occurred. The garden was in full bloom, and they could hear a group of children from a local school on an educational visit, learning about botany and the story of the family that had transformed tragedy into triumph. If someone had told me 20 years ago that I would be here, living this life, I would have laughed, Jonathan said, intertwining his fingers with Victoria's, both hands now marked by the garden work they did together every morning. Life has surprising ways of taking us where we need to be, Victoria replied. Sometimes through pain, sometimes through joy, but always through love. A young journalist approached them, part of a team doing a follow-up story a decade after the original documentary. Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, if you could give advice to families struggling with secrets and wounds from the past, what would it be? Jonathan and Victoria looked at each other, silent communication passing between them after years of partnership. Victoria answered, that truth, however painful, is always the most fertile ground for growth. That forgiveness isn't weakness, but the greatest strength there is, and that it's never too late to plant seeds of change. And, Jonathan added, squeezing Victoria's hand, that sometimes the most unexpected answers to our cries of anger are exactly what we need to hear. That when we say, nobody silences me, the universe might respond with someone who doesn't want to silence us, but to teach us to speak the language of the heart. The journalist thanked them and walked away, leaving the couple in peace. As the sun set once more over the Sterling garden, Jonathan and Victoria remained seated in comfortable silence, observing the living legacy they had created together. Not just in flowers and trees, but in transformed lives, in embraced second chances, in love that had triumphed over years of lies and pain. Thank you, Jonathan whispered in Victoria's ear, as he did every day. For what? She asked, as she always asked. For answering me that day, for not letting me keep shouting into the void, for showing me there was another way to live. Victoria turned and kissed him softly. Thank you for letting me answer, for being willing to listen, for proving that even the hardest hearts can learn to love. And so, as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the Sterling estate garden continued to grow, to bloom, to inspire, a living testament that from the most unlikely confrontations can be born the most beautiful stories of love and redemption. Friends, if you've made it this far, if this story has touched your hearts in some way, give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear about the power of forgiveness and transformation, and comment with your own stories of overcoming. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us it's never too late to change, to forgive, to love. Until next time, and remember, sometimes the answers we don't want to hear are exactly what we need to transform our lives. May you all find your own gardens to cultivate and your own voices too, not silence, but set free.